No mai, haere mai. Welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. My name is Jason, and I'm the Communications Manager at Maxim Institute. This is our weekly short-form podcast. These podcasts are released in tandem with our weekly column and are a chance for you to hear in depth from the column's author about some of the thinking that went into producing their final piece. Today we talk to Maxim researcher Thomas Scrimgeour about his recent column. Thomas, good to have you with us, mate, for this edition of the Maxim podcast, talking about your column, Know Your Limits. Now, you start off talking about the Roman Empire, which we love to talk about, but you kind of draw a long bow between the Roman Empire and policymakers today. How does that draw that out for us? Like, I'm not sure the connection here.
Yeah, so in the column, talking about a Roman general. So if a general went on a campaign and it was victorious, the spoils of war, they returned to Rome, the eternal city, and a parade was thrown in their honor. It's called a triumph. And so the story goes, it was so magnificent a parade that they had to have a slave accompany the Roman general just to whisper in his ear, Memento, mori. Remember, thou art mortal. The concern was that the general would forget that he was in fact immortal and think himself a god. And so I guess the connection I'm trying to draw out is that policymakers too have that temptation.
Because my connection would have been with like the All Blacks winning the World Cup and getting a parade. You're like, oh, remember guys, you're just mortal. But no, you went somewhere else. I'm glad.
Yeah, exactly that. But I mean, governments can do amazing things. They are very powerful entities. In fact, politics, whatever else it is always about the exercise of power. And so the temptation policymakers often have is, well, we could just do this. We could just solve any problem as if they don't face constraints. And when you start acting as if you aren't immortal, if you think that you are in fact able to do anything, you're liable to make some really poor decisions that will in fact hurt people.
And so you talk about our own kind of memento mori things here that you would say are constraints of reality. What are some of those?
Yeah, so I guess I talk about the value of having these little phrases to carry around. They remind you of some bigger ideas. And so the first one I talk about in the column is that prices are information. This idea goes back to really an economist named Friedrich Hayek in the 20th century. Who won the Nobel Prize for economics, and he gives this lecture on the role of prices as information. We're sometimes are tempted to think these are really arbitrary things, as if in a time like we've had recently, where grocery bills keep going higher and higher. It's just because the supermarkets have been greedy and
they just want more money.
They just want more money, so they set the price higher arbitrarily. But the problem with that is that, for 10 years prior to our recent inflation problems, grocery bills stayed steady for a long time, but it wasn't because the supermarkets were more charitable than they are now.
Less greedy business, didn't want to make as much money, and then they decided, oh, well, I reckon we could get a few more dollars out of these people.
Yeah, and so when you look at something and you're like, man, why is that so expensive? You always have to ask the second question, why isn't it more expensive? That the price that it is set at and is being sold for says something about the nature of the world.
So an example that you give in the column is like the housing market. How does that work in terms of prices and things like that?
Yeah, so housing is one of the kind of policy areas that I'm quite interested in and do some work on here at Maxim. And so it's been front of mind. Over in America recently, Joe Biden, before he stepped down, had proposed a policy for nationwide rent control. It's pretty fair to say that house costs are very high for people. And so then policymakers want to solve it. And so rent control is really tempting.
Seems like a good idea, right?
Yeah.
We just fix this rental price and this is what it is.
Really easy to do as well. You just write a law. Prices are not allowed to increase or must increase by no more than X amount. You write the law, problem solved. But the problem with that is that it assumes the price was arbitrary, that it doesn't convey some information. Typically, high prices represent a shortage, that there is a limitation. And so if our housing market isn't producing enough houses, so prices are shooting up. If you just say how our prices have to stay cheap, you haven't solved the material problem. There's a shortage. Yeah. And so people will still miss out.
Okay. So the idea then is the fact that something is going up represents a reality of what's happening on the ground, essentially, with the goods that they're trying to purchase.
Exactly. So you always have to keep your mind on the material problem, and the price is simply a representative of a range of material facts.
Okay, and so this happens like in a rent control kind of a minor scale. What happens when this sort of thing goes kind of big?
Yeah,
because you could say that, well, the government then, why don't they just control everything, or all parts of the economy, and say, well, we'll fix the price for petrol, for housing, for electricity, for everything.
Well, I mean, so the economist I mentioned earlier, Friedrich von Hayek, he was an Austrian, and so was, I guess, writing in the mid-20th century, really cognizant of the Soviet experiment and kind of those really centrally planned economies. And he opposed them really forcefully. It was sort of one of his, the main things that was animating his criticism. And it wasn't because planning the economy was sort of wrong on first principles. It wasn't that the free market was some kind of divine order, but that the value of the market was that you didn't need a central person to know what was short, what was plentiful. You know, the price system allowed things to be allocated. The Soviet experiment, you know, they tried to centralize all of their farming, and it led to famines because it couldn't respond to the various constraints and new things developing. That a centrally planned economy was unresponsive to changes on the ground.
So the idea is that, you might suddenly have a shortage of stuff over here, but by the time that central government learns about that and manages or tries to order excess from over here, it's gone out of control. Whereas with a free market, it's able to adjust in real time in some ways.
Yeah, and you can think about that when we have shortages of really specific things. You know, about 10 years ago, we had a shortage of kiwi fruit. There was a PSA disease that was devastating for kiwi fruit farmers. If you had to kind of have a central person quantifying what was the shortage, how do we then allocate, you know, kiwi fruit around the country, it would become a really complicated thing. But really, there was a shortage of kiwi fruit. Prices went up, and most people chose to buy other fruit and didn't buy kiwi fruit. And people who really, really valued their kiwi fruit were able to make that choice. But the price allocated that efficiently, whereas if you have a central planner, they're going to really struggle.
So that's the first idea, is prices are information. The second one is a bit more kind of out there, I guess. Money represents trust. Can you break that down for us? Because I always thought money is like either an abstract thing out there that just is numbers on a spreadsheet, or it represents like a tangible thing, like the microphone here that we're talking into is represented by a certain dollar figure. And so if I have this many dollars, it equals this. So how does it equal trust as well?
Yeah. And that's a really natural way of thinking about it. If we go back to Adam Smith, the kind of the father of modern economics, you know, he talked about money that way. You know, we think about originally there was gold, and then banks started issuing paper money because it was easier to carry around than gold. And so in a sense, the gold represented a physical asset. But over time, it kind of came to just circulate on its own and never be exchanged for gold. Recently, we've experienced mass amounts of the cost of everything rising, right? So it's not that there's been a shortage of one thing, but that almost everything in our lives has been getting more expensive. What that is telling us is that the level of trust in the money itself is declining. Okay. There's too much money chasing too few goods. So when we think about governments and they have to choose to spend money, they aren't limited in the same way we are. You know, people often draw the analogy, you know, well, a government has a budget and I have a budget, right?
Yeah. Around budget time, that phrase gets trotted out. Well, just manage it like manage my household budget. We just spend less than we earn and we'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, for household budgets, it's a really great way to think about it. But the rules are slightly different for a central government because the government issues the currency. They also set the rules on borrowing, and they're actually able to borrow at much lower rates. So in a sense, governments face different constraints than us, but they are still constrained. Governments should perhaps borrow large amounts of money to build infrastructure. They probably shouldn't do it to just spend on whatever they want. But their constraints are they can borrow and leverage their ability as a government to spend on big things, but only to the extent that people still trust the money. We've seen in recent years incredibly low interest rates, as well as very ambitious government spending, and some international issues cause a lot of inflation. And so the government has had to reel all that back in. The Reserve Bank raised interest rates, and people have felt the economic cost. But we needed to regain trust. Argentina is probably the extreme example of a country that for decades, no one has trusted the money. They've always gone for US dollars whenever they could get their hands on it because the government would just freely increase the amount of money. So there was no trust, and it has these real economic costs for people.
Okay, so those two principles, how should they affect, if they're fundamental truths of reality, how should they affect policy decisions?
Yeah, so I think the first one, that prices are information, means that whenever we are struggling with the price of something, say housing, we always have to start looking for the material problem. What's the information telling us? And so policymakers shouldn't try and solve the price problem. They should try and solve the underlying material problem, and prices will be solved.
So it's more of a sign pointing to the problem.
Yeah.
So you follow the sign, find the problem, fix that, you'll fix the prices.
Yeah, exactly. If you just try and solve the price without the material problem, you're going to hide it but not solve it.
Okay. And the second one, money represents trust. How would that affect policy?
I think really it means that governments have to live within their limits. Currently we have a government that's still running quite a large deficit, and that at times and occasions is fine to run a deficit, but not so much that inflation keeps running away from us. So governments always have to keep living within their means, and you're recognizing they are constrained.
But their means are a bit more than the average household, but not inexhaustible.
Exactly, that's the one.
Yeah, cool. Oh, Thomas, thanks for being with us today. Lots to think about, very informative. Thanks for your thoughts.
Thanks for having me, Jace. A Roman general, parading victoriously home into the eternal city, was accompanied by a slave with one job: to whisper in his ear, Memento mori. Remember, thou art mortal. The intoxication of self-glory could cloud the mind and cause one to forget. Just as Roman generals needed reminders of their mortality to stay grounded, modern policymakers require similar cautions. It is tempting to believe we can reshape reality at will. However, certain fundamental truths must be our memento mori, to remind us of our limits. The phrase free market has fallen into disrepute of late, and not without reason. But markets are everywhere, and are, in a very real sense, unavoidable. The economist Friedrich von Hayek defended free markets as forcefully as anyone, not from first principles, but because of one simple idea: prices are information. When rents become unaffordable, a politician will always be on hand to suggest rent control, as if, by decree, we can ignore the market signals. But the high price of rent is typically a signal that houses are scarce. No amount of wishing away high prices can escape that material problem. Indeed, it will almost certainly make it worse. But what about when all prices rise? After several years of high inflation, last week, we learned it is finally close to the target range of 1 to 3%. The economic cost of getting back here has been rough. High interest rates have stretched borrowers to their limits, and unemployment is rising. The great titan of modern economic thought, Adam Smith, was not without his limitations. He conceived of money as a direct substitute for property, merely an efficient representation of the physical asset. His near contemporary, Henry Thornton, the father of modern central banking, saw much further. Thornton's unique insight was far simpler. Money represents trust. Confidence in both the system and the state of the economy. Indeed, trust characterizes all economic relationships. Inflation took off for several reasons, but the vicious problem is that once started, inflation tends to drive itself. The expectation of future inflation, otherwise known as declining trust, causes price rises in the present. A government's ability to spend is limited to the extent it can maintain trust in the system as a whole. The pandemic rewrote the rulebook for how the New Zealand government spends money, and we now have one of the largest structural deficits among advanced economies. The practical result is that the government has now little room to move on budget spending. Any new dollar spent will require a cut or a new tax. After several years of spending beyond our means, our limits have returned to bite. We should carry these little ideas. Prices are information, and money represents trust into every policy conversation. Like a general entering Rome, believing himself almost a god, we must heed our limitations. Absent an effective market that allocates goods and a widespread trust in economic stability, all our other policy goals will be in vain. Remember, thou art mortal.
Thanks for listening to the Maxim Institute podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us and keep up with the rest of our research and analysis of politics and policy in New Zealand, you can sign up on the homepage of our website to get our monthly forum email and invitations to future Maxim Institute events. You can search and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. From the team at Maxim, mā te wā, goodbye for now.